So Ukraine continues to reel under a barrage of Russian drone and missile strikes. Moscow is steadily stepping up its assault across the Ukrainian front line, with Kharkiv and Chernihiv reporting some Russian air attacks. In Kharkiv, at least about 3 people have been killed and several others are reportedly wounded, where air alerts were sounded across Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk and Sumy, among other regions. Now, Kiev is also heading back at the Russian war machine. Kiev reported multiple overnight drone strikes on Russian oil facilities, including its largest Rosneft refinery and an oil depot in Luhansk. Ukrainian military claims that the facility plays a role in supporting Russia's armed forces. Now, the aerial attacks have come amidst efforts to negotiate peace in Ukraine. It also comes a day after the French President Emmanuel Macron pledged to firm up security guarantees for Kiev and committed to deploying reassurance force troops once a peace deal is reached. But Putin has ruled out the presence of any Western troops and has even called them as legitimate targets for the Russian military.
Regarding potential foreign military contingents in Ukraine, it is one of the root causes behind drawing Ukraine into NATO. Therefore, if some troops appear there, especially now during military operations, we proceed from the fact that these will be legitimate targets for destruction.
Now, the Trump administration hasn't explained as to what its role in future security guarantees for Ukraine is likely to look like. And now it has decided to slash funding to train and support European troops in countries bordering Russia. Now, for decades, countries bordering Russia, the likes of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, the Baltic states as they are known, had relied on military aid worth millions and millions of dollars to strengthen their defenses against Russia. But now Washington wants to take a back seat and leave the European security in the hands of European powers. Now, simply put, Donald Trump wants Europe to take more responsibility for its own defense. Within NATO, Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia spend the highest in terms of their percentage of GDP on defense, but they also, remember, have small economies, the biggest deterrent against an emboldened Russia, making US funding highly important for them. The shift in American policy has sent alarm bells ringing in Europe as the American military support has become. The European countries now find themselves in a bit of fix because the Americans don't seem committed enough to offer the security umbrella. While they've shown willingness to shoulder the burden of securing Ukraine's security, Donald Trump and the United States continue to push them to do more without guaranteeing reliable American security support in return. All right, now joining us on the broadcast from London, we've got Maximilian Hess, who is a Central Asia Fellow at the FPRI and the author of Economic War, Ukraine and the Global Conflict Between Russia and the West. Mr. Hess, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on WION. Now, I want you to weigh in on something very interesting that the Trump administration has announced, where it is seeking to end the European security programs that are focused on Russia. In your assessment, to what extent does this American pullback from European security change Europe's security calculus?
Well, thank you so much for having me. Firstly, that Donald Trump has been an unprecedentedly weak president on deterring Russia is by now without question. However, funding still exists and is in place until 2026 for the Baltic training programs that you speak of. It is authorized by Congress. There is bipartisan support in Congress for renewing such funding. It is unlikely to be an issue that the Trump administration in particular fights over, although it has shown that it is willing to violate U.S. legislation to not distribute funding approved by Congress. There are separate legal disputes going on over that matter. So Donald Trump is certainly once again projecting weakness, but does not have the final say on these matters, and has in some other areas begun to offer Europe support. And it certainly is true that Europe is increasing its defense spending at unprecedented levels in response to these developments.
Right. Now, it's interesting that you say that Donald Trump is being weak by, not offering the American security umbrella. The Europeans are trying to put up what is being described as the coalition of willing. This is something that Keir Starmer has repeatedly spoken about. The European leaders in their summit yesterday spoke about European troops being stationed in Ukraine once the war in Ukraine ends. But the Americans are not very enthusiastic about this idea. In your assessment, is this coalition of the willing, can it even fructify?
Well, there's two problems there. Certainly, any credible defense guarantees for Ukraine would require U.S. involvement, even if it's just in ensuring that European troops are able to rotate in and out of Ukraine. And then the reports that we have seen have been around Ukraine and Europe's allies, requests for potential U.S. support for some kind of an air shield or no-fly zone to come along with that security guarantee. That being said, any kind of European or other troop deployment in Ukraine has been predicated thus far on a ceasefire being agreed. And Vladimir Putin shows absolutely no indications of being seriously willing to negotiate a ceasefire. Since Donald Trump first proposed that earlier this year, Putin has not only made a public mockery of the Western position by having Donald Trump entertain him in Alaska, but has actually increased his demands, including for a buffer zone in Ukraine, and with the Russian Defense Ministry threatening to take over additional territory. Now, there are areas where sanctions pressure is increasing and where the U.S. can do a lot more, but we are looking at the beginning of the end of Trump's initial policies on Ukraine, not at the beginning of the end of the war, tragically.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Hess, for joining us with that perspective there.
Thank you for having me.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.